The first note cut through the room like a thread of silver, soft, fragile, and utterly impossible to ignore. At the center of the candle-lit ballroom, Elena Miles sat at the grand piano, her hands trembling slightly as they danced over the keys. The melody, Clair de Lune, aching and beautiful, floated above the clink of champagne flutes and the rustle of silk gowns. For a moment, even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. And then, unbelievably, so did Damien Wexler. He had been mid-sentence, scolding a junior investor with a smirk that could slice through steel. Just moments earlier, he'd humiliated the venue director for the vulgar lighting arrangement, made a cruel joke at the expense of a trembling waiter, and called the string quartet a fine effort for high school-level talent. He was in one of his moods, the kind that made seasoned executives flinch and personal assistants pray for invisibility. But now he stood still. One hand rested on the back of a leather chair, the other in his pocket. His sharp features, usually locked in a smug grin or cold stare, softened slightly. His brow furrowed, not in disdain, but confusion or wonder. He wasn't used to being moved, especially not by someone like her. Elena didn't notice the silence building around her, didn't notice the servers pausing in their steps, or the gallery of donors tilting their heads to listen. She didn't even notice him. All she could hear was the music, the one thing that had always made sense when the world didn't. When the final note faded into silence, the room stayed still. A strange hush clung to the air, like everyone was afraid to breathe wrong and break it. Then, a slow clap echoed from the front of the room. Just one. Damien. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just nodded, once, and continued clapping until others followed. Elena blinked, confused. Her hands still hovered above the keys. She hadn't expected applause. She hadn't even expected to make it to the end, and certainly not that reaction from him. She stood quickly, gave a small, awkward bow, and hurried off stage before anyone could stop her. As she disappeared into the shadows, Damien sat down slowly, his expression unreadable. He poured himself a drink he wouldn't touch, and for the first time that evening, he said nothing. The next morning, sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, soft and golden, painting the pristine marble floors of Damien Wexler's penthouse in shifting patterns. He stood barefoot, dressed only in tailored black slacks and an open white shirt, holding a porcelain espresso cup that had long gone cold. He hadn't slept. Not really. The night before should have been forgettable, another evening of forced smiles, whispered negotiations, and hollow toasts. He had gone into it expecting boredom, and left with something far worse, a song stuck in his head. Clair de Lune. He could hear it now. Not just the music itself, but the way she had played it. Hesitant at first, then bolder, richer. Her hands had trembled, but her sound hadn't. There was something unguarded in the way she played, as if the notes had been pulled from places deeper than memory. Damien rarely let anything touch him, not since his mother's death, not since the boardroom had become his only arena, but last night something had cracked open. He didn't understand why that performance, out of thousands he'd heard, had unsettled him. And Damien Wexler despised not understanding things. He set the espresso cup down and walked to the opposite side of the room, where his piano stood untouched. It was a Bösendorfer, sleek, black, expensive, purchased more for aesthetic symmetry than personal use. He lifted the lid and stared at the keys for a long time. Then he closed it without playing a single note. "Her name is Elena Miles," Bennett said later that morning, following Damien into his office as if he were treading into a storm. "She's 30, lives in Queens, works at a community music school, teaches 3 days a week. The rest of the time, she volunteers for a youth conservatory program and plays small performances when asked. No publicist, no manager, no history of commercial contracts." Damien didn't look up from the file. "Any recordings?" "A few scattered online. Mostly recital footage. She's not on any platforms professionally." "She should be," Damien muttered under his breath. Then louder, "Thank you." Bennett stood awkwardly, waiting for more instructions. "You may go," Damien added, glancing at him. "Yes, sir." When the door shut, Damien leaned back in his chair, pressing 2 fingers against his temple. The file lay open before him. Faded photographs, printed resumes, snippets of handwritten notes from some local outreach program. He stared at a candid photo of her at a school recital, hair in a loose bun, sleeves rolled, surrounded by children and sheet music. She was smiling, not the strained, careful smile she had given at the gala. This one was real. He closed the folder and looked out his office window. Midtown stretched endlessly below, pulsing with life and impatience. He wondered, just for a moment, what her morning had looked like. Elena's apartment was small but warm, filled with mismatched furniture, houseplants in chipped ceramic pots, and stacks of sheet music that spilled from every surface like paper ivy. The upright piano stood by the window, a little out of tune, but deeply familiar. She had lit a candle that morning, something lavender-scented. Not for any reason other than to make the space feel gentle. She needed that today. The night before still echoed through her. She'd barely spoken to anyone after the performance, had slipped out as soon as her part ended, breathless and disoriented. She hadn't expected applause. She certainly hadn't expected it from him. Elena had grown up watching Damien Wexler on television, the cold, commanding figure who could dismantle a CEO with one comment. She knew his reputation: ruthless, brilliant, impossible, the kind of man who didn't clap unless someone handed him a merger agreement worth billions. And yet, he had. She didn't know what to make of it. "Elena," her roommate called from the hallway. Marissa was already dressed, her nursing scrubs rumpled from the dryer. "Did you eat yet?" "I will," said Elena. "You always say that," Marissa replied. "I mean it this time." Marissa stepped into the living room and saw her friend sitting cross-legged on the floor, sheet music spread around her like a protective circle. "I heard about the gala," Marissa said gently. "Lauren called me, said you were brilliant." Elena smiled faintly. "She's being generous," she said. "No, she said he applauded." "Damien Wexler!" exclaimed Marissa. Elena's smile faded. That part might have been a hallucination. Marissa sat beside her, pulling her legs in. "How did it feel?" Elena paused. "Like I wasn't supposed to be there, but somehow the moment didn't care." "That's poetic," said Marissa. "It's true." There was a long silence. "Are you going to look him up?" Marissa asked. "I already know who he is," Elena replied. "No, I mean really look him up, see what he's about." Elena hesitated. "That's not my world." "But maybe your world brushed his just for a second," said Marissa. Elena turned her head toward the window. Outside, the street bustled, taxis honking, children walking to school, sunlight glinting off wet pavement. "It was just a performance," she said softly. But something in her voice didn't quite believe it. Later that afternoon, Elena made her way through the narrow halls of the neighborhood music school, where she taught. The walls were covered in crayon drawings and group photos. One from last December showed her in a Santa hat, trying not to laugh as her students posed with cardboard instruments. She loved this place. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. She passed by her colleague Jonah in the hallway. "Hey," he said, raising an eyebrow. "You're famous." Elena groaned. "Please don't start." "I'm serious. I had 3 parents ask me today if that woman from the Wexler Gala was the same Miss Elena who teaches beginner piano," said her colleague. "I hope you said no," Elena jokes. "I told them yes, but that you charge $500 an hour now." Elena laughed despite herself. Jonah smiled. "Good for you, by the way. It's not easy to stand up in front of people like that." "I didn't know they were going to be people like that. I thought it was just donors," said Elena. Jonah laughs. "Donors are people like that." She shook her head, opening the door to her classroom. The small space held 2 keyboards, a whiteboard, and a few beanbags. One of her students was already inside, practicing scales with determined concentration. Elena sat beside her quietly, and for the next hour, the world faded, replaced by the simple joy of helping a child find rhythm. Back across the city, Damien sat in a board meeting, listening without listening. The voices around him droned: market caps, liquidity options, global expansion strategies. He usually lived for this. It was the game he was born to win. But he kept seeing her face, not from the gala but from that photo in the file, the one with her surrounded by children, laughing. It had struck him more deeply than he expected. Something about the unguarded joy, the absence of calculation, the way she seemed most at home among people who had nothing to offer her but presence. It was so far from the world he knew. And yet he couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, Damien returned home late. He passed through the penthouse with mechanical movements. Jacket off, tie loosened, shoes discarded near the door. He poured a drink and sat on the edge of the piano bench. The Bosendorfer loomed in front of him like a question he didn't know how to answer. He opened the lid and stared at the keys again. After a long pause, he played the first few notes of Clair de Lune. His hands were stiff. His timing was off. He stopped before the first phrase was complete. The silence afterward was deafening. He exhaled, then reached for his phone. At that same hour in her apartment, Elena sat at her desk writing practice notes for her students. Her feet were tucked beneath her, and a pot of tea cooled beside her elbow. She had planned to spend the evening watching an old film, something black and white, something where no one used the word synergy. But she couldn't focus. She kept thinking about the moment after the music ended, the pause, the strange hush, the way the applause had started with a single pair of hands. His hands. She shook her head and stood, walking to the window. Below, the city shimmered, not with the cold shimmer of money but with something gentler. She closed her eyes just for a moment, and in that moment, she heard the music again. She wasn't sure if it was memory or imagination, but it made her smile. Back in the penthouse, Damien stared at the name on his phone screen. Elena Miles. His thumb hovered over the call button. He didn't press it. Not yet. Instead, he turned the volume up on his speaker system, found a recording of Clair de Lune, and pressed play. Then he sat in the dark, listening, and for the second time in his life, he allowed himself to feel something he didn't know how to name. The next morning, Elena Miles stood at the sink in her small kitchen, letting her tea go cold as she stared at nothing in particular. Outside the window, the city carried on without her. Cars passing, pigeons cooing from rooftop edges, neighbors slamming doors below. But inside, the world felt suspended. A strange hush had followed her home from the gala, and it hadn't lifted since. Her phone sat untouched on the counter. She'd checked it several times already that morning, not expecting anything, and yet still hoping. What would it even look like? A text? An email? Someone like Damien Wexler didn't leave voicemails, did he? "Elena," Marissa called from down the hallway, her voice muffled by the sound of pulling on a jacket. "Do you want anything from the store? I'm grabbing a few things before work." Elena raised her voice just enough to carry. "Could you get more tea?" Marissa stepped into the kitchen, already zipping up her bag. "You've had that same mug in your hand since I walked out of the shower." "I'm not drinking it, just holding it." Marissa tilted her head. "Still thinking about last night?" Elena let out a slow breath and turned toward her. "I can't stop. The performance, that room, the way he looked at me after." Marissa raised an eyebrow as she asked, "He as in Damien Wexler?" Elena nodded and said quietly, "He clapped, and then just stared. He wasn't like the man I've seen on the news. It felt different." With a knowing sigh, Marissa grabbed her keys. "Just promise me you won't let your imagination fill in blanks he never offered to explain." "I won't," Elena said, though the words rang a little hollow, even to her. Marissa paused at the door. "Men like that don't need to lie with words. They lie with silence. Just be careful." "I will," Elena replied. Marissa left, the door shutting softly behind her. Elena turned back to the window and stared at her untouched tea. She hadn't even realized the water had gone cold. Then her phone buzzed. She stared at the glowing screen. Unknown number. Her stomach clenched. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she picked it up, answered with caution in her voice, and said, "Hello, this is Elena." There was a pause, short but unmistakable, before the voice replied, "This is Damien Wexler." She nearly dropped the phone. Steadying her breath, she said, Yes, hello." Damien's voice was composed and measured as he said, "I wasn't sure if I should call, but I decided that not doing so would be rude." Elena blinked, thrown off. "Rude?" "You performed at my event," Damien replied. "And then you disappeared. I didn't have the chance to speak to you." Elena gripped the edge of the counter and said, "I didn't think you wanted to." "I did," Damien answered. "In fact, that's why I'm calling." Still unsure where this was going, Elena asked, "Why?" Damien's voice lowered just slightly. "Because what you did with that music, it disrupted something I didn't expect to feel." Elena's breath caught, and she responded slowly, "You don't strike me as someone who's often caught off guard." "I'm not," Damien admitted, "which is why I'm calling now. I'd like to meet." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "Meet?" "I want to offer you something," Damien said. "A proposal, strictly professional." Now more intrigued than confused, Elena asked, "What kind of proposal?" Damien replied with no hesitation, "I'd like to commission you to perform privately, 1 hour a week, just for me. I'm not asking for lessons, nor for anything transactional beyond the music. You'll be compensated fairly. But the request is simple." Elena blinked at the absurdity of the offer and said, "You want me to play music for you, like in your living room?" "In my office, if that's more comfortable," Damien replied, "or anywhere you choose." The thought made her laugh softly, just once. "You'd come to Queens?" "If that's what it takes," Damien said plainly, "but I'd prefer a neutral space, one that doesn't overwhelm either of us." Elena leaned against the counter and said, "You understand this is a very strange thing to ask of someone." "I do," Damien answered, "but I also know how rare it is to find something honest. I don't hear it often. I heard it from you." She stayed quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you always speak like this?" "Only when I'm telling the truth," Damien said. She exhaled slowly. "Fine, tomorrow noon, your office." There was no pause. Damien answered immediately, "I'll send a car." And just like that, the call ended. Elena lowered the phone and stared at it in her hand. Then, aloud to herself, she whispered, "What exactly am I getting myself into?" The next day, at precisely 11:55 a.m., a black town car pulled up outside her apartment. The driver emerged in a pressed suit, holding the door open as if this was routine. "Elena Miles?" he asked formally. She nodded and stepped in, smoothing the front of her dress. She'd worn something clean and simple. Soft gray wool, modest neckline, her hair tucked back neatly. Not elegant, not casual, something in between. She spent the ride staring out the window, heart beating louder with each block. When they arrived at Wexler Holdings, she was ushered past reception and into a private elevator before she had time to reconsider. There was no music, no chatter, just the low hum of motion as the numbers climbed. The doors opened to a room of quiet luxury. No gaudy signs, no noise, just dark wood, glass, and control. Damien stood at the far window, his back to her, as though he'd been waiting without checking the clock. When he turned, his expression was unreadable, neither a smile nor a frown. "Elena," Damien said calmly, "thank you for coming." She stepped into the room and said, "It felt rude to say no." Damien gestured to a leather chair near his desk. "Please sit." Elena sat slowly, tucking her coat into her lap. "So, what is this really?" Damien moved around the desk but didn't sit. "It's exactly what I told you. 1 hour a week. You play. I listen." She raised an eyebrow and said, "No commentary? No notes?" Damien shook his head. "None. I'm not your critic. I'm only asking to be present." Elena crossed one leg over the other. "And why me? You could pay anyone to play for you." "I don't want anyone," Damien said plainly. "I want you. Because when you play, I stop thinking. That doesn't happen to me often. Elena studied him. And what happens when the novelty wears off? Damien met her gaze without flinching. Then I'll stop asking. She didn't look away. And what happens if I say yes and later regret it? You walk away, Damien said. I won't stop you. Elena let the silence stretch, then said softly, You sound like someone who's used to being left. Damien replied just as softly, I am. She blinked. It was the first unguarded thing he'd said all afternoon. After a long pause, she leaned forward slightly. All right, I'll do it. Damien's voice remained steady as he asked, Starting next week? Elena shook her head. No. I want to see what I'm agreeing to. Where would I be playing? He gestured to the far end of the office, where a sleek, grand piano waited. She hadn't even noticed it until now. This room, Damien said. She walked toward it slowly, trailing her hand over the lacquered lid. Then after a moment she turned and said, Next week, same time. Damien gave a small nod. Thank you. As she walked to the elevator, she paused briefly in the doorway. Without turning around, Elena said, You really should learn to play again. Your hands, remember. Damien's voice followed her gently. Not well enough. Then the doors closed. That evening, Elena sat on her couch, her hands resting on her knees, her thoughts louder than usual. Across the city, Damien stood alone at the window of his penthouse, Claire de Lune playing once again. And for a second time, he let the music carry him somewhere he didn't have a name for. It was raining the first time Elena returned to Damien's office to play. Not a dramatic, movie-worthy storm, just a soft, gray drizzle that softened the edges of the city. She arrived 5 minutes early, umbrella in one hand, damp scarf clinging to her neck, and was ushered upstairs without needing to say her name. The building remembered her now. The receptionist offered her tea, which she declined. She didn't want to owe anyone anything, not even politeness. When the elevator doors opened onto the top floor, Damien was already there, sitting in the same leather chair near the piano, sleeves rolled neatly up to his elbows, the faintest sheen of tiredness beneath his eyes. He stood when she entered, always composed, always formal. Elena? Damien said with a slight nod. Thank you for being punctual. I said I would, Elena replied evenly. She walked past him without comment, setting her bag down gently beside the piano bench. The room was quiet, the city blurred behind rain-flecked windows, no assistants, no distractions, just the two of them and the piano. Damien remained seated in his chair, hands folded over one knee, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer direction. He didn't ask what she intended to play, and she didn't tell him. Instead, Elena sat down and rested her fingers lightly on the keys. After a moment of stillness, she began to play. A Chopin nocturne this time, gentle and melancholic. The sound drifted through the room like the rain outside, soft and searching. As she played, she let herself sink into the music, not to impress him, not to prove anything, just to remember who she was when the world stopped watching. Damien didn't move. His eyes were closed, but his face was alive in a way she hadn't seen before. Less like marble, more like flesh. His posture remained rigid, but his breath slowed. She noticed because she couldn't help it. When the piece ended, Elena didn't look up right away. She held the silence, letting the last note fade on its own terms. Then she spoke first. I don't usually play for an audience that doesn't clap. Damien opened his eyes and replied, I assumed you weren't looking for praise. I'm not, Elena said, but I'm also not used to silence that intense. Damien tilted his head slightly. Is it uncomfortable? No, Elena admitted, just unfamiliar. There was a pause before Damien responded. I didn't clap because I didn't want to disturb it. You gave something fragile. It felt wrong to interrupt it. Elena looked at him. Really looked. That's surprisingly self-aware. Damien's mouth twitched, almost into a smile. Don't get used to it. That made her laugh, softly but genuinely. The weeks began to pass in rhythm. Every Thursday at noon, she arrived. The same routine: arrive, play, leave. She never stayed longer than she had to. He never asked for more than he'd offered. But something shifted with each session. At first, it was in the music. She started taking risks, choosing more personal pieces, playing with less precision and more heart. She played Ravel with reckless energy, Beethoven with restraint. Once, she played a piece of her own, unnamed and unfinished. Damien listened always, with the same intensity, never breaking the moment, never checking his phone, never interrupting. But the change was in him, too. He started asking questions, small ones at first. After a performance one afternoon, he said, "Was that yours?" Elena glanced at him. "The last piece?" He nodded. "Yes," she said. "Still working on it." Damien didn't offer praise. Instead, he said, "It felt like the kind of memory you only revisit when you're alone." She met his eyes and replied, "That's exactly what it is." He nodded again, and nothing more needed to be said. Their conversations began to stretch beyond the music. One day, after she played Schubert, Damien asked, "How long have you been teaching?" "About 4 years, Elena said as she packed her things. "Started out of necessity. Stayed because it reminded me why I fell in love with this in the first place." "And what was that?" Damien asked. Elena paused, then said, "Music doesn't lie." He nodded slowly. "People do." She didn't respond to that. The air in the room felt heavier suddenly, and yet she didn't leave. Instead, Elena asked, "Why did you stop playing?" Damien looked toward the grand piano, his gaze distant. "I was never good enough to make it a life," he said. "My mother taught me. She played every morning, Chopin mostly. After she passed, I stopped." Elena's voice was softer than usual. "You could start again." Damien shook his head. "No." The silence afterward, it was too loud. She understood exactly what he meant. It wasn't just the music that was changing, it was the space between them. There were no compliments, no confessions, just a growing familiarity, one that wasn't rushed or named, but lived in glances and moments. One day, Elena brought a composition notebook with her. She didn't say why, and Damien didn't ask. She placed it on the piano bench beside her and flipped it open before she began. After the piece, he asked, "May I see it?" Elena hesitated, then handed it over. Damien took it gently, as if the pages were delicate. He flipped through it slowly. Handwritten notations, crossed-out phrases, phrases in the margins like, "Too sentimental?" or "Try inversion here." "You're hard on yourself," Damien said. Elena smiled faintly. "I have to be." "Why?" "Because if I'm not, I start believing that mediocre is enough." Damien handed the notebook back to her. "This isn't mediocre." She looked at him carefully. "You're not the person I expected you to be." Damien didn't react. "Neither are you." That night, Elena went home and played the same unfinished piece for herself, thinking of what it meant to be truly seen, even for just a second. But not everything came easily. One afternoon, during a session that had begun like all the others, Damien interrupted her mid-piece. "Start again," Damien said, his tone unusually sharp. Elena stopped playing, her fingers hovering over the keys. "What?" "You rushed it," Damien said. "The second movement, you skipped the breath between the phrases." Elena stared at him. "You're not my instructor." "No," Damien said, "but if you're going to play it honestly." That struck her harder than it should have. She stood slowly closing the lid of the piano. "If you wanted a perfect performance, you should have hired a machine." Damien stood as well. "I wanted you, but not if you're holding back." Elena's voice was tight. "You don't get to demand vulnerability just because you paid for an hour of my time." Damien's jaw clenched. "I'm not paying for you to play safe." Elena picked up her coat. "Maybe I shouldn't come back." There was a long pause. Then Damien said, quieter this time, "Maybe I shouldn't have spoken." Elena stared at him, unsure whether the apology was real. Finally, she said, "You asked me to bring something real. That means you don't get to control what it looks like." I know, Damien replied. And if I do come back, Elena said, it's because I choose to, not because I'm paid to. Damien gave a small nod. Understood. She left without another word. That night, Damien sat alone in his office. He didn't put on music. He didn't pour a drink. He just sat there in the silence she'd left behind. It felt unbearable. He didn't sleep. Elena didn't return the next week. He noticed. Everyone around him noticed. Bennett commented that he seemed distracted, which earned him a look sharp enough to end the conversation. Meetings were shorter, conversations more clipped. He hadn't realized how much he had come to rely on those Thursday hours, not just the music, but the space it created in him, the interruption of his routine, the slowing of his breath. It was her presence that had changed the tempo of his life. Now the silence rang louder than any music. A week later, without warning, Elena walked into his office at precisely noon. No appointment, no call, no expression on her face. Damien stood when he saw her. She didn't greet him. She walked to the piano, sat down, and began to play. It wasn't Chopin or Debussy, it was her, a new piece, raw, unpolished, stirring in its imperfection. Damien didn't sit. He stood near the window, listening but not watching. When she finished, the silence afterward was filled with more meaning than any apology. Then Elena closed the lid gently and turned to face him. I didn't come back for you, Elena said. I came back because the music deserved more than silence. Damien nodded slowly. I'm glad you did. Her voice softened. So am I. They didn't speak again that day. They didn't need to. The following Thursday, the rain had cleared. The sky above Manhattan stretched pale and cloudless, a rare reprieve from the season's gloom. Elena arrived at Wexler Holdings early, walking the final blocks rather than accepting the car service Damien usually sent. She needed the quiet rhythm of her footsteps to settle her thoughts. Her music had shifted again. Ever since the confrontation and the return, something inside her had softened, even as it remained cautious. Damien hadn't spoken about it, hadn't referred back to that tension, but she could feel its imprint in the silence between them. It was no longer cold. It was patient. When she reached the top floor, Damien was already seated by the window, reading. He looked up as she entered and closed the book without marking the page. Elena, Damien said with a calm nod. You're early. I walked, Elena replied, removing her coat and placing it neatly on the stand. It's too nice a day to be driven. Damien didn't smile, but something flickered in his eyes. Approval, maybe. Or simply curiosity. What will you play today? I don't know yet, Elena said honestly, settling at the piano bench. Something that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is, Damien gave a quiet nod. That sounds appropriate. She played a slow, reflective piece, a Brahms intermezzo, intimate and quietly aching. Her fingers lingered on certain notes longer than written, bending the tempo to emotion. She wasn't performing for him. She was offering a piece of herself to the room, and he happened to be there. When the final chord faded, Damien remained still for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he stood and walked toward the piano, not close enough to invade her space, but closer than usual. I'd like to see where you teach, Damien said. Elena looked up, surprised. Why? Because you spoke of it once, Damien replied, and I don't understand it. That's a rare feeling for me. I'd like to see why it matters to you. Elena hesitated. It's not glamorous. I'm not looking for polish, Damien said simply. She studied him. It's not a stage, Damien. There are no applause breaks, no catered luncheons, just second-hand instruments and kids who don't always show up. Exactly, Damien replied. That's why I want to see it. Elena didn't answer right away. Then she nodded and said, Saturday morning, 9 sharp. Don't wear a suit. Damien raised an eyebrow. I don't own anything else. Borrow one, Elena said. Blend in or you'll scare the kids. He showed up at 8:58 a.m., in jeans and a button-down shirt that didn't quite know how to wrinkle. His shoes were too clean, his posture too measured, but he was trying, and Elena noticed that effort before anything else. The music school was housed in an aging community center on a quiet street in Astoria. The lobby smelled faintly of floor polish and poster paint. Children's artwork covered the bulletin boards, alongside flyers for free meals, coat drives, and literacy workshops. Damien paused in the doorway, taking it all in with unreadable eyes. Elena met him at the entrance to the music room and held out a volunteer name tag. "Wear this. Otherwise, they'll think you're the fire inspector." Damien took the tag and clipped it to his shirt. "And what should I say if they ask who I am?" "Tell them you're shadowing me for community service," Elena said. "Is that what I'm doing?" Damien asked. Elena shrugged. "Depends on what you get out of it." Inside, the room buzzed with motion. A boy no older than 6 banged rhythmically on a set of plastic buckets. A teenage girl played a Chopin prelude from memory, her eyes fierce with concentration. Another student sat at a battered keyboard, playing scales with meticulous slowness. Damien stood near the doorway, uncharacteristically quiet. Elena approached the girl at the keyboard and adjusted her wrist gently. "Don't force it. Let gravity do the work. Play like your hands are falling into the notes." The girl nodded and tried again. The sound came out smoother. From the back of the room, Damien watched it all. The chaos, the joy, the imperfections. It wasn't just different from his world, it was the opposite of it. He didn't belong here, and yet he didn't want to leave. After the class, Elena joined him by the hallway lockers, where he was still standing, arms crossed, gaze distant. "What did you think?" Elena asked, wiping her hands with a paper towel. "It's not what I expected," Damien said. "No?" Elena asked. "What did you expect?" Damien glanced down at her. "A broken system, a room full of excuses. What I saw was effort. Honest effort." Elena leaned against the wall. "That's the only currency we trade in here." Damien's voice was quiet. "It reminded me of something I used to know, something I buried." Elena turned toward him. "What?" Damien looked at the far wall, where a crayon drawing of a girl playing piano hung crookedly from a pushpin. "My mother used to run something like this, out of our apartment. We didn't have space, but she made it anyway. Kids from the building, some from shelters. I was maybe 10 when she started." Elena didn't speak. "She died 2 years later," Damien continued. "It all stopped. The piano stayed, but no one touched it again. Not for a long time." Elena said gently, "Is that when you stopped playing?" Damien nodded. "I didn't know how to make it mine without her." The vulnerability in his voice was subtle, not trembling, not cracked, but undeniable. It was the first time she'd heard it, and she felt it like a shift in air pressure. After a moment, Elena said softly, "Music doesn't leave us. We just forget how to listen for it." Damien turned to her, his voice lower. "You never forgot." Elena smiled, small and sad. "I did, for a while, but it found me again." They stood in silence, the weight of shared memory binding them more than words could. Later that afternoon, they walked down the street together. Damien carried a paper bag filled with donated sheet music, something he insisted on helping with, though Elena hadn't asked. They passed a small bookstore, and he stopped in front of the window. Inside, a young woman played an upright piano by the children's section, singing softly to herself. Damien watched for a long moment, then said, "Do you ever wonder what your life would look like if one moment had gone differently?" "All the time," Elena replied. Damien asked, "Do you regret anything?" She didn't answer right away. Then Elena said quietly, "Yes, but I've learned to live with those regrets like they're part of the melody." Damien looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means the piece would sound different without them. Maybe not better. Maybe not worse. Just different." Damien nodded slowly. "That's a difficult way to think." Elena replied, "It's the only way I know how." They reached the train station. Elena stopped at the top of the stairs. "This is me," Elena said, pointing toward the entrance. Damien looked at the metal railing. The worn paint, the chipped steps. It was a far cry from the world of glass elevators and private drivers. "You're taking the subway?" Damien asked. "I always do," Elena replied. He looked like he wanted to say something, to offer her a ride perhaps, or suggest something different. But instead, he only said, "Thank you for letting me see this." Elena met his eyes and said, "Thank you for not trying to change it." She turned and disappeared down the stairs before he could respond. Damien stood there a moment longer, the city rushing around him. For once, he didn't feel like a man above it all. He felt like someone learning to listen. The invitation came in the form of a single line of text. "There's a gala Thursday night. Come with me." No name, no greeting, but she knew who it was. Elena stared at her phone for a long time before replying. "Why?" His answer came quickly. "Because it's easier to endure those rooms with someone who sees through the nonsense." Elena hesitated. The thought of standing beside Damien in his world, that curated world of wealth, dominance, and unspoken codes, filled her with quiet dread. Still, a part of her wanted to understand that part of him. She wanted to see the man in his element, not just the one who sat quietly beside a piano. She typed 2 words. "I'll come." On Thursday evening, the car arrived at her door precisely at 6:30. Elena had borrowed a dress from Marissa, deep burgundy, understated, with a vintage silhouette that felt more like herself than anything too new. Her hair was pulled back into a loose knot, and she wore no jewelry other than a small ring she hadn't taken off in years. When she stepped out of the elevator into the marble lobby of the Metropole Grand, the scale of the event hit her like a wave. Men in tuxedos clustered near pillars. Women in shimmering gowns glittered beneath crystal chandeliers. Laughter rang like wind chimes, light, practiced, indifferent. Then she saw him. Damien, standing near the entrance to the ballroom, speaking with 2 men in suits that cost more than most people's yearly salaries. When he saw her, he smiled, a subtle curve of the mouth, reserved for her alone. "Elena," Damien said as she approached, "you look—" She raised a brow. "Don't lie." "I was going to say unmistakably out of place," Damien replied, the corners of his mouth twitching. "But in a way, that's refreshing." She smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." "Good," Damien said, "because I meant it as one." He offered his arm. She hesitated, then accepted. The room was grander than she expected. Gilded ceilings, string quartets, oil paintings hung on temporary walls as part of an auction. The air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and obligation. Damien led her through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging nods and clipped greetings with people whose names he never said aloud. He didn't introduce her. At first, Elena thought it was an oversight. But as the minutes passed, and he continued greeting board members, CEOs, and donors without acknowledging her presence, a subtle tension began to rise in her chest. She wasn't invisible, but she wasn't seen either. Finally, at a table near the rear of the room, a woman in a silver gown leaned toward Elena and asked sweetly, "Are you Damien's new assistant?" Elena froze. She opened her mouth, but Damien spoke first. "No," Damien said with a polite smile. "Elena is a musician. She plays for me privately." There was nothing malicious in his voice, but the phrasing, the choice of words, landed like cold water down her spine. Plays for me, like she was part of a collection, like a possession, like background music. The woman in silver nodded as though that made perfect sense, then turned back to her wine. Elena set her glass down without sipping it. They were seated at a long table near the front, under a wash of golden light. Damien chatted effortlessly with the man to his left, laughing once, a sound she rarely heard. His world seemed to fit around him like a tailored suit, every word, every gesture, perfectly measured. Elena didn't speak. She couldn't stop thinking about the phrasing. Plays for me, not a friend, not someone I care about, not even a guest, just function, utility, safe language. She glanced around the room. No one else here looked like her, Not in clothing, not in posture, not in expression, and the longer she sat at Damien's side, the more acutely she felt the gap between them. Later that night, as the event wound down and the car doors shut behind them, Damien turned toward her and said, "Thank you for coming." Elena stared out the window. "You didn't introduce me." Damien seemed surprised. "I didn't?" "No," Elena said. "You never said my name once." Damien leaned back slightly. "I didn't think you wanted attention." "That's not the point," Elena said quietly. "I didn't want to be erased." Damien looked at her carefully. "I didn't mean to do that." "But you did," Elena replied. "And then when someone asked who I was, you said I play for you." "I didn't mean it that way," Damien said, his voice more serious now. "It was meant to explain what we share." "You don't explain what we share," Elena said. "You either include me or you don't." Damien was quiet for a long beat. "That world is complicated." "I'm not asking you to change it," Elena replied. "I'm asking if I have a place in it. Any place at all." "I don't know," Damien admitted. The honesty cut deeper than if he'd lied. Elena didn't show up the following Thursday. No message, no explanation. She simply didn't come. Damien waited. The piano stayed untouched. He canceled his meetings for the afternoon and sat alone in the stillness she used to fill. The hours passed, and the silence deepened. In Queens, Elena returned to her routines, teaching, mentoring, composing. But her music had changed. Even the children noticed. One afternoon, her student Jason asked, "Why does your piano sound sad?" Elena smiled gently and said, "Because sometimes it misses someone." The boy frowned. "Did they move away?" "No," Elena said. "They just got quiet." On Saturday morning, Marissa found her in the kitchen, staring at a blank page of sheet music. "Are you going to call him?" Marissa asked. Elena didn't look up. "He didn't ask me to belong. He asked me to be useful." Marissa leaned against the counter. "You don't have to explain. Just don't carry silence like it's yours to own." Elena nodded, but the silence stayed. But a few days later, something changed everything. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and late-night exhaustion. Everything felt a little too bright, too artificial. The world inside moved slower than the one outside. Every beep, every footstep in the hallway waited with urgency and fragility. Elena stood at the reception desk, her coat still damp from the rain, her breath coming faster than she wanted it to. The nurse looked up. "You're here for Damien Wexler?" "Yes," Elena replied quickly. "He was brought in tonight. I got a call from his assistant." The nurse checked the computer. "Room 504. He's conscious, but resting." Elena nodded. "Thank you." She moved through the hallways on instinct, not noticing the posters on the walls or the faint hum of machines behind half-closed doors. Her mind was fixed on one thing: seeing him, hearing his voice, understanding what had happened, and why, of all people, he had asked for her. When she reached his room, she paused just outside the door. Her heart thudded. She hadn't seen him in weeks. Not since the night she left his world without a goodbye. Inside, the light was dim, the blinds pulled halfway closed. Damien lay propped up in a hospital bed, his face pale beneath the glow of the overhead bulb. His left hand was wrapped in gauze, and a nasal cannula fed him low-flow oxygen. Monitors beeped softly at his side, tracking each heartbeat. He turned his head slowly when she stepped inside. "Elena," Damien said, his voice raw. Elena crossed the room and stood beside the bed. "They said it was smoke inhalation." Damien nodded. "And a few cracked ribs. Nothing dramatic. Just stupid." "What happened?" Elena asked, sitting beside him. He looked at the ceiling for a moment before replying. "There was a fire at one of our midtown properties. I was there for a walkthrough. Someone from the night crew was trapped. I didn't think. I just went in." Elena's throat tightened. "You ran into a burning building?" "I've made worse decisions," Damien said, trying to smile. "But fewer with better intentions." "You could have died," Elena whispered. "I didn't," Damien replied. But it made me realize I've lived most of my life like I already had. Cold, detached, in control. Elena reached for the bed rail. And now? Damien looked at her, eyes clearer than she remembered seeing them. Now I know what it's like to be afraid I wouldn't get to say something important. To you. She didn't speak. She let him continue. I should have said it that night, Damien said. At the gala. When you walked beside me in a world that didn't deserve you. You didn't have to say it, Elena replied softly. I heard everything you didn't say instead. Damien's voice dropped. You deserved to be seen, and I hid you behind silence. Elena squeezed the metal rail gently. You weren't cruel, Damien, but you were careful. And sometimes careful is the worst kind of distance. Damien shifted slightly, wincing. I didn't know how to name what you were to me. I was afraid if I said it out loud, I'd lose control of what little I still understood about myself. And now? Elena asked. I'm ready to stop understanding everything, Damien said. I just want to be near something real. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Elena said, There's a recital on Friday, at the school. It's not a gala. There's no marble or chandeliers, just folding chairs and off-key violins. I'd like to come, Damien said. I want you to hear what music sounds like when no one is watching, Elena said. That's what those kids give me every day. That's what I tried to give you. You did, Damien replied. You always did. She reached for his hand, the uninjured one, and held it gently. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. Damien was discharged 2 days later. He declined the driver and instead asked Bennett to bring him a plain navy sweater and jeans. When Bennett raised an eyebrow, Damien simply said, It's time I learn how to feel uncomfortable on purpose. He spent the next few days alone in his penthouse, not in silence, but in reflection. He walked past the grand piano every morning. Once he even sat down and pressed a few keys. They sounded hesitant, like a voice long forgotten trying to remember how to speak. He didn't try to perfect the sound, he just let it be. Friday came with crisp air and blue skies. Damien arrived at the community school before anyone expected him. No security, no driver, no tailored coat, just himself. Elena greeted him at the side door, her hair loosely pinned, a folder of sheet music tucked under one arm. She looked surprised but not unsteady. You came early, Elena said. I didn't want to miss anything, Damien replied. Elena gestured toward the small auditorium. There's no seating chart, just sit wherever feels honest. Damien walked in and took a seat in the middle row. The chairs were mismatched, the floor creaked, but there was a warmth in the room that no gala could replicate, a buzz of anticipation, laughter, spilled juice, whispered encouragement. Children in slightly wrinkled dress shirts waited in the wings, clutching sheet music. Parents sat with coats in their laps, ready to cheer for their children with unconditional pride. Damien watched it all with quiet awe. The recital began. One by one, the children played, some with confidence, others with trembling hands. Some rushed, some forgot notes. One child played an entire scale backward, then shrugged with a grin, and the crowd still applauded. Each performance was a world of its own. And then, just before the final act, Elena walked on stage. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She sat at the upright piano and opened a notebook. Inside were pages covered in scribbled measures and crossed-out bars. Her eyes met Damien's across the room. Then she played. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't meant to be. It was raw, human, and full of spaces where emotion broke through the structure. The melody carried traces of her journey, her doubts, her defiance, her longing, her hope. It sounded like everything she hadn't said, everything she had waited for someone to hear. And Damien heard it. He didn't blink. He didn't move. When the last note faded, the room held its breath. Then applause erupted. But Damien didn't clap right away. He stood, not to make a scene, not to draw attention, but because the music had moved him in a way that made sitting feel impossible. And then slowly he clapped, and he didn't stop. After the recital, they walked outside together. The sun was setting. The sky was streaked with soft purples and faded gold. The air carried the smell of pavement and spring blossoms. Elena looked over at him. "You stood." "I didn't plan to," Damien said. "It just happened." Elena smiled. "That's how I wrote the song." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "I started learning again." She opened it. Scales, fingerings, basic chords, and a few tentative lines of melody. Simple, searching. "I had to start somewhere," Damien said. "You didn't have to," Elena replied. "You chose to." "I chose you," Damien said. "Long before I had the courage to say it." She stepped closer. "And now?" "I want to learn how to stay," Damien said. "Not as someone who owns the room, but as someone who listens when it matters." Elena's voice was soft. "You already know the hardest part." "What's that?" Damien asked. She touched his hand gently. "Showing up." He exhaled, eyes steady. "Then let me keep doing that. Every Thursday, every Tuesday, every wrong note and quiet room." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned in and pressed her forehead against his. And the city, always too loud, softened around them. If this story touched you, we'd love to know. If you were Elena, would you have accepted Damien's proposal? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters here.